them to speak. This afternoon's agenda, in one item is a carryover from last meeting, which was in February, which we were not able to have because of the major snowstorm that occurred. So I hope we got effective notice to folks out about the cancellation of that meeting, but the roads were not accessible, so we really weren't in a position to hold this discussion. At this time, I would like for the folks who are the members of the MISC to introduce themselves and their affiliation. Maybe Sheila, if you could start on that end. And I think our microphones are not on, so you need to click it, a little switch.
Is that working okay? All right. Sheila Carey, Developmental Disabilities Planning Council.
Good afternoon. Brian Daniels, representing Acting Commissioner Sheila Poole from the Office of Children and Family Services.
Lisa Rosano from the New York State Justice Center.
Hi, Barbara Stubblebine, representing Greg Olson from the State Office for the Aging.
Good afternoon. Sean Byrne, representing OASIS Commissioner Arlene Gonzalez-Sanchez.
Hello, Mario Mussolino, Executive Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Labor.
Good afternoon. John Allen, representing the Office of Mental Health.
Roger Bearden, representing the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities.
Hi, I'm Mark Kissinger, representing Dr. Zucker at the Commissioner of Health.
Kent Sopris, New York State DOT.
Turn the mic on.
Hi, sorry I'm late. Kim Hill, public member from the Assembly Task Force on People with Disabilities.
Adam Prizio on behalf of Bruce Darling, public member.
Harvey Rosenthal, public member, New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services.
Denise Figueroa, public member, Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley.
And thank you to all of you and also the folks who are attending. I wanted to mention at the outset, we had received some different feedback around enhancing accessibility, including having CART, which we do have. If there are any further comments or any ways we can make these meetings even more accessible, if there's something that we've forgotten, we do welcome those comments. Just come speak with me or speak with Annette, who is at the back. And obviously, we want to make this meeting as accessible to all individuals as possible. So on today's agenda, we have two items. The first, in the Olmsted report, we had identified as an area requiring a deeper dive the possibility of engaging in a mobility management pilot project in order to enhance the access to transportation for multiple sectors of individuals with disabilities and people who are aging. I guess 2 years ago in the budget, there was money made available for that study, and then the study was performed by the Public Consulting Group. That study's been up on the MISC website since February, when we had planned to be releasing it and have this presentation. And as I mentioned, we had the snowstorm, and they were gracious enough to come back in May to provide the overview of the study that they performed and recommendations that they advanced. And so I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves, and when they finish their presentation, there will be an opportunity for any questions or comments that folks may wish to make with respect to that and any feedback that folks may want to give. And then we'll defer any generalized feedback on other issues for the public comment period. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Public Consulting Group. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Salisbury. I acted as the project manager for the engagement. I have Christine Newhall with me as well, and she was a transportation expert who provided great insight and assistance with the project. She'll be going through the recommendations, and I'll start out just providing a general overview and get into the findings that we found. So just to go through, we'll revisit some of the project goals, we'll talk about the findings, and then, as I mentioned, we'll get into the recommendations. As part of our agenda, I think there's a few things that we want to touch on. We had significant stakeholder engagement, and so I want to get into who we spoke with, where across the state we spoke with individuals and providers, and give some of the findings that we gathered from those interviews and focus groups. And then we'll talk about, the need for coordinated transportation to really improve accessibility and availability of transportation for individuals with disabilities. I'll provide insight into our findings, and then we also did look at other states, peer states, states around the country that are doing really innovative, interesting things around coordinated transportation and increasing availability of transportation. So I'll get into some of those states that we spoke with and researched, and then we'll wrap up with the recommendations and any questions. So on slide 5, as Roger mentioned, just providing a quick background and purpose, our project was funded through funds from the 15-16 budget, and we were looking at how the transportation system in New York State currently meets or fails to meet the needs of individuals with disabilities. So that was really the basis for our study, is looking at the gaps that are currently present in the system, and then coming up with recommendations for how to potentially improve the transportation system. So we had a few different phases. The first one was really just project management, developing the plan of how we would engage with stakeholders. The next one, which was the bulk of the time, was really getting on the ground in New York State and getting the stakeholder input all across the state, meeting with different individuals and providers and their families to understand what's going on, because we know that the needs in New York City versus Buffalo, Syracuse, the northern part of the state are very different. So we want to make sure that we captured that in our report. So the next phase is what I mentioned with the national best practices. We looked at a lot of different states and what they're working on and what they're doing around this space. And finally, we had our recommendations report. And all of these reports, as Roger mentioned, are up on the MISCC site. We did have an interagency committee that we met with. This was comprised of OPWDD, OMH, DOH, DOT, SOFA, DDPC, OASIS, and SED related to their vocational rehab. And MISCC, we presented early on, some of you may remember, with the MISCC group, just to let you all know what we were planning on doing, get some input on places we should look for feedback or stakeholders to engage. And then we also met with OPWDD Provider Association, and we did a series of focus groups and also interviews and surveys. The next slide is a map. It might be difficult to see from here, but we wanted to capture all the different stakeholder engagement pieces that went into this report. And so this map is a visual of we conducted over 40 interviews. We facilitated 5 focus groups in different areas in the state. We also distributed over 1,000 surveys to providers and also transportation companies. And so you'll see that we tried to make sure that we received feedback from all different areas. So before we get into the findings, I just want to provide some definitions of what we're speaking about when we talk about mobility management and human service transportation coordination, because they're similar, but they do have some differences. Mobility management is the customer-focused approach that connects the riders to transportation services. So this might be a service to help them know what's available in their community. So some sort of one call, one click system, which is called, where you can either look online or call a service to find out what's available. There are a lot of different modalities for mobility management, and we'll get into some of those as we go through, but it's really the services that help connect the riders. The human service transportation coordination is really the broader look at coordination of how to achieve efficiencies and how to coordinate at a broader level so that people are provided with the critical transportation services that they need. So I think one important thing to point out is the need for coordinated transportation. And I think this is really the impetus for this report as well. There is an increased need for accessible and specialized transportation resources in New York State. We heard that with the gap analysis, that there are many areas that don't have public transit or paratransit available, or the subway systems aren't accessible, the elevators don't work. So really trying to understand the need, and that there is an increased need for accessible options. Also, as you know, the focus on person-centered planning and community inclusion, there is a critical need for the transportation as well, because trying to get people out into the community, into activities and into community housing, you know, trying to provide more access, more transportation options as there is a greater demand and need for that transportation. And I think what, you know, the main takeaway is that without transportation to and from services and activities, people cannot be fully integrated. The next piece I'll get into is related to our findings. We have some high-level observations that I'll share, and then I'll get into some of the more detailed findings that we gathered. So I think one of the major things, and this is an issue across the country, is there's really no consistency or clarity in transportation or funding mechanisms. I think some of that stems from the federal government's approach to funding transportation, where there's a lot of different pots. A lot of them aren't coordinated. They may have different requirements or stipulations, and there's really no consistency. Another thing that we found is that there is limited data, and in some cases non-existent data, on transportation costs, on rates, the number of trips being provided, and then also the number of individuals being served. So we really had trouble getting a sense of the scope and the magnitude of transportation being provided in New York State. Another piece, which I think New York State is really, you know, there are different pockets and different areas working on this, but in terms of mobility management best practice sharing, this is happening in limited cases, but it's not from a statewide coordinated perspective. I think a lot of counties or regions are starting to work together on mobility management, but it's really on a you know, word of mouth and trying to hear what their neighboring counties are doing, but there's no coordinated effort. And finally, I think many of you would agree, the options in rural areas of the state are much more limited compared to the urban areas, especially in terms of access to paratransit, public transportation, and just the means to be able to get around. So on slide 13, I'll go into some of the main themes of the findings. And so we broke these down into 4 different themes, really what we had heard and what we wanted to focus on and what we wanted to base our recommendations on. So the first one is transit infrastructure gaps. And this really is focused around availability and accessibility of the public transit. As I mentioned, the same sort of thing with paratransit and affordability of taxis and accessible taxis as well. The other issue is, you know, this creates a barrier to employment because people rely on the transit infrastructure to be able to get to their jobs, and this often creates a barrier to be able to have consistent employment. And finally, I think another thing that we heard consistently is long or unreliable trips, especially when people were trying to access paratransit. You know, they might end up on a vehicle for a couple of hours, they may miss an appointment, they may miss being to work on time, and so this was a result of the issue with the transit infrastructure. Another piece that we found was a gap is related to the laws and regulations. And so one thing we found is there are different regulations among the different agencies. There are restrictions on drivers, on hiring drivers who can transport people, depending on the agency that they're served by, depending on the disability. Also, difficulty to meeting the funding source requirements. So really making sure that there's an understanding of what's required to receive funding, what's required to maintain the funding to help support some of these activities and initiatives. And finally, I think while there's a robust non-emergency medical transportation system, I think some people have found that transportation is really the only option available to them that doesn't cover a lot of other activities within the community. So going to a baseball game or a movie or an art gallery. So those sort of things aren't covered to be able to get to those activities. The next gap is related to vehicle use, and this we found was a consistent theme among many of the agencies and even the providers. Buying vehicles, especially vehicles that need to be modified, it's very expensive, and providers and agencies are trying to maximize the fleet that they have, and they're unable to buy new vehicles, and so an issue arises with the age of the fleet. We heard that some vehicles were 20 years old. They didn't even make the parts for them anymore. They were very rusted. They broke down often. And that creates an issue with people being able to have consistent transportation to and from where they need to go. On the same vein, it's a replacement and backup vehicle availability. So, having the funds to be able to replace those aging vehicles, having a backup vehicle in case a vehicle breaks down. I think that was an area that providers and agencies alike weren't able to, they didn't have those resources, which limited the transportation that was available. Along the same lines, so high mileage on the vehicles, vehicles getting in the 200,000, 300,000 miles, and really pushing, what those vehicles are able to do and, being able to repair them. Finally, the vehicles are not being maximized. So looking at how often are vehicles sitting in a driveway not being maximized, are there opportunities for coordination among providers or among different programs or agencies to make sure that those vehicles are maximized, are in use? If a provider operates a program, they have a day program, another provider has services on the weekend, what are the options there for being able to share those vehicles to maximize the trips and the routes and the cost? And finally, accessibility of the vehicles. So making sure that the proper modifications are on the vehicles, whether that's, within a program that they have enough wheelchair accessible vehicles and enough vehicles to really support the individuals that they serve. Finally, our last theme is related to business operations. And this is getting into staffing and driver challenges, so recruiting, retaining qualified drivers, staffing the administrative side of managing a transportation infrastructure, increasing costs. As we all know, fuel costs increase, insurance costs increase, so it's really difficult to stay on top of those costs. Decreased funding, which, with financial difficulties, often funding decreases, and it's not met with supplementary funding. Data management, as I mentioned before, being an issue of being able to track the trips and the costs. And finally, the insurance costs and liabilities constantly increasing. The next piece is related to our literature review, and this is really, we had a couple components of our best practice research. We looked at over 40 articles looking at human service transportation coordination. What are some of the areas of issues and barriers? What's happening across the country in terms of, I think the programs are fragmented, the needs are increasing, which is a lot of what we found when talking to stakeholders. Mobility management, we also looked at articles related to that to really understand mobility management activities that go into transportation coordination and how they go hand in hand to really ensuring a comprehensive system. So next we looked at state level coordination case studies. We looked at Massachusetts, Florida, and Georgia, who each have a different form and approach to human service transportation coordination. Fortunately, Christine came from, she was previously the director of the Human Service Transportation Agency in Massachusetts, so she provided some really great insight into Massachusetts process and how they, the pain points and what they endured doing this transition. And so that was helpful in trying to understand having a coordinated system at the state level. And Florida and Georgia, as I mentioned, they have differing forms of coordination that they coordinate at the state level to try and maximize resources. Finally, real quick, I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for recommendations. We did look at mobility management best practices just to see what's going on across the country or across the state in different counties. And so at least 26 counties have mobility managers or mobility management programs or services in place. These plans and activities are documented. They're local public transit, human service transportation coordination plans. These are required for specific federal funding called Section 5310, and those are prepared at the county level. And so we just provided a quick snapshot of some of the different strategies that are in place, where they're in place. Are they statewide? Are they in pockets? So the one call, one click is really that opportunity to be able to find resources for transportation in your area, vehicle sharing, that's being done in a county in New York. Travel training, I think this is an important one for helping people learn how to use public transit in their area, whether that's New York City in the subway system or out in Rochester using the bus system. And then also looking at voucher programs. So trying to understand what's available for people to access taxis or now transportation network companies, which are the Uber and the Lyft sort of companies. So I'll pass it over to Christine to talk through the recommendations, and then we'll leave a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Sarah. So based on what we learned throughout, can everyone hear me okay? Yes. All right. Based on what we learned from our research in the project, we developed 3 broad-based recommendations. They are geared toward kind of 3 levels of government, one being at the state agency level, another being at the regional level, and another being at a more regional or local level. So before I go into the specific recommendations, on slide 20, we just wanted to provide a kind of an overview of what implementing these recommendations would mean to New York. As Sarah said, while we did look at the literature from states across the country that have done and been successful in human service transportation coordination and mobility management, no state has really taken it on holistically like we're recommending for New York. States have done human service transportation coordination, but have left out a mobility management component. And they've done things in pockets where states have just coordinated Medicaid brokerages or Medicaid transportation. But coordinating with multiple agencies to achieve maximum efficiencies has not been done widely across the country. And we feel that New York would really benefit from this type of coordination. So it would be a paradigm shift from what is currently happening in the state, but would really put New York at the forefront of this type of reform and coordination. So to move into the specific recommendations, at the kind of topmost level, at the agency level, we're recommending the establishment of a statewide human service transportation coordination infrastructure. What that would mean is that New York would establish a statewide human service transportation coordination office that would be responsible for managing the transportation programs of multiple New York state agencies. Essentially, any state agency that has a population requiring unique transportation or specialized transportation needs would be eligible to join or participate in the office. The office would create centralization of transportation programs and would create management and operational efficiencies across agencies. What we found was that in our research, agencies are managing their transportation programs so differently from one another, and even within agencies, there were great differences regionally, programmatically, financially about how transportation programs were managed. This would give the state a really unique bird's eye view and oversight mechanism to see where opportunities for cost sharing could be created across agencies and within agencies, increase occupancy on vehicles, be able to forecast based on any sort of eligibility criteria that would be changing, be able to forecast trip volume and costs going forward, and really have a much stronger handle on human service transportation programs throughout the state. The statewide coordination office would involve a transportation brokerage model where there would be an entity, a management entity in charge of coordinating a transportation provider pool to provide all of the transportation services for multiple agencies. The agencies would work together with the statewide office to develop standards for serving the people that are allowed trips under this model, and establish guidelines together with that office that would be serving multiple agencies. It would necessitate a transportation rate carve-out from agency services. What we found in our research is that transportation rate is embedded for the most part within programmatic service rates. So carving that out so that it could be a standalone rate would be crucial to the success of this model. And then finally, this model would require regulatory and waiver review to ensure that everyone who needs access to transportation under this model would be allowed, and the state would be able to be reimbursed for those services appropriately. Different functions of the transportation office. When you talk about, what would that statewide entity actually do? It would provide a number of functions that would be located centrally. It would be responsible for cross-agency coordination. So looking at specific agency programs and seeing where there's a best practice within an agency. If an agency is doing something really great, communicate that to another agency and really achieve efficiencies statewide that way. It would be responsible for contract management and rate establishment. So agencies would be taking out of the business of establishing rates, and the burden would fall to the statewide management office. We would anticipate that the rates would move to a cost-based model, and the statewide office would be responsible for procuring those contracts with the broker or the entity that would be kind of managing the provision of the transportation service. The office would be responsible for payment, cost analysis, as I said before, quality and performance oversight. During our research, the degree to which state agencies and providers perform quality management was greatly varied from agency to agency and region to region, and this would provide standardization and central oversight for that function. Operations management, standards development, data analysis. As Sarah mentioned, we had trouble collecting data from many of the state agencies. The Department of Health was able to provide us with specific rate and cost data as they had moved over to their transportation management model. They were able to effectively capture data on costs and rates. But many of the other agencies that we worked with, because the transportation is embedded within the service rate, it was hard to carve out and identify exactly what's being spent. So this would allow for greater data analysis of transportation funding, and also provide technical assistance resources to other agencies and organizations that may not necessarily be part of the coordinated system. If for some reason a state agency would not be participating in the coordination office, that office would still be available to provide specialized technical assistance in any sort of transportation related area for that agency. And finally, the office would offer mobility management guidance. When we get into the third recommendation, and the second one, we felt as though there should be a mobility management link on all levels of the recommendations that we are putting forth. So establishing a mobility management role at the statewide level would be crucial to the success of the office as well. The second recommendation is to establish regional coordinating councils across the state. So this would be to establish a statewide regional infrastructure for mobility management. We are recommending that New York establish 10 regional coordinating councils that would mirror the boundaries of the 10 regional economic development councils, ensuring statewide coverage for these. They would be an organized forum for information sharing, replicable best practices. They would cover all areas of the state, urban, rural or suburban, and encourage participation from respective regions. We really see the function of the regional coordinating councils to work with the mobility managers that are in each region to share best practices, maybe establish a regional mobility management action plan, and kind of hold that the people who are responsible for participating in that action plan responsible for outcomes and ensure sustainability for mobility management activities. What we found in our research is that there are so many great things going on across New York, but some may run out because of grant funding. Somebody might leave to go to another job, so therefore that mobility management effort kind of fades away. So by ensuring that there is a mobility manager within each of the regional coordinating councils who's moving these initiatives along and potentially securing some extra funding from the feds or from the state or from any other human service or mobility management entities that's offering funding for this type of model to really ensure the sustainability of those things going forward.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just a quick question. I'm getting a number of emails from people who are wondering if we're going to restore the connection, the online stream. Is that just out for today? Or was it just being worked on, or is it just not able? I don't think it was ever on, but I think somebody was saying they were working on it. But I just want to tell a couple of people, should they be waiting, or is it just not going to happen?
I have no insight on that. Do the technology folks in the room have an insight as to? Okay,
Well, probably not. No,
as you might appreciate, I'm not watching the internet.
No, I get it.
Right
I get it.
now.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I appreciate it. I didn't know that it was down, so that's
okay.
And I'm glad that sometimes people actually look at it on the net too. That's also very pleasing.
They've tuned us in. They just can't get in.
So will you just in the back, when you guys have an update on that, just let me know, and we'll let folks know. Thanks, Harvey.
You're welcome.
Okay. As far as membership of the regional coordinating councils, we are recommending that all state agencies who would be participating in the statewide human service transportation coordination model participate in the regional coordinating council as well at a regional level. New York State DOT and regional public transit agencies, the transportation broker, whoever that may be, the regional planning agencies, local transportation providers, advocacy groups serving individuals with disabilities in the region, human service organizations and providers, mobility managers, individuals receiving New York State services, other community stakeholders, and area agencies for aging and independent living centers. And that's just a suggested minimum for participation in membership. And then the final recommendation that we are putting forth is to conduct a mobility management pilot project. So this would be geared toward the local level or the regional level, and we are recommending that 3 strategies be put into place and be implemented initially in 3 regions of New York State, but eventually expand to have statewide coverage. These 3 mobility management strategies, one call, one click system, travel training, and travel vouchers are only 3 mobility management strategies. There are far more. We felt as though these are the 3 that can be most easily replicated across regions initially. And depending on the needs of the region, others could also be put into play as well. So a one-call, one-click system would be kind of an electronic database of all of the mobility management and community transportation resources within one region. And it really provides a method for individuals to look and see what's available to them and to then actually book a trip. So that can be implemented in urban, suburban, or rural areas. The second recommendation is to provide a travel training program. We did hear across New York there are some pretty robust travel training programs that are currently happening. We would anticipate that we would use some of the best practices we learned from those programs to help formulate a new travel training program. Travel training is where an individual is provided with personalized service to help them understand and learn the bus schedule, learn how to ride the bus, the subway, any form of transit, until they're comfortable doing that independently. This, as Sarah pointed out earlier, this has become more and more important as people are moving out into the community and are dependent on transit for activities of daily life and really accessing all of their needs in the community. And then the final thing is travel vouchers. So this is where an agency or organization that serves individuals would issue a voucher for a person to ride either public transit, if it's available and accessible, if not, to issue a travel voucher to ride a van that's operated by another provider within a community or some other, a family member, or it doesn't have to be just for public transit. So the travel voucher could really be used for any purpose, but just to allow people greater flexibility in the transportation options that they choose to use. So that is a summary of the 3 recommendations that we've put forth. And now I think it's time for questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask.
So thank you, and quite a bit to digest. And that presentation, as well as the underlying report, are available. So I don't know if we've been able to restore the webcast, but it will be available, as well as an archive of this video. So obviously not as good as not having the webcast go down, but we'll do what we can. So public members, I see a couple of interested looks and fingers in the air. Harvey?
So thank you. That's a really excellent report, and much more sophisticated than the report a work group did about 15 years ago from the MISC on this thing. We had a work group. We met. We tried to address some of this, but you've certainly gotten into the weeds, and I congratulate you for that. And I congratulate the administration for putting up the resources and the commitment to that. And if it means that we're going to move to the forefront, that means we're not there now, and that would be important for the state to, we pride ourselves on having a strong disability and homestead policy. So I'm glad for the report, and I think it should be taken very seriously. I have a couple of questions. In no order, we had talked years ago about all these vans that are sitting in parking lots and going down potentially. I mean, the worst visual is 6 vans go down the same country road to get 1 person each. Are you suggesting that one van pick them all up, and then all the operational problems? Does the driver have to meet certain eligibility to pick up different groups, and how do we get around that? And were you saying how that would be coordinated? Oh, we're getting 3 calls over in Greenwich, Washington County, and they want to go to Saratoga. Why don't we just see if they can all go with this one van we'll send over? Could you say more about that? Because it's exactly what we were talking about, but I don't think we ever moved the ball on it.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the hallmarks of a coordinated system is to improve the efficiency and the vehicle occupancy. And when agencies are able to share vehicles among multiple consumers, then costs go down for everybody. One of the things that is critical in allowing for that to happen is the agencies working together under, with this statewide office that would be established in establishing universal driver requirements, vehicle securements, vehicle age.
So I would imagine forgive me, but the agencies, I'm sure, I would imagine would have all kinds of liability questions if their van,
absolutely,
their driver's being used. Have you considered that at all?
Absolutely. And in this model, it wouldn't necessarily be, oh, this is OPWDD's driver, or this is OMH's driver, or this is their van, or this is their van. It would be transportation providers who are under contract to provide transportation to any agency.
Freestanding?
Yes.
Not the ones that are taking people from a mental health drop-in center to like a bingo, God forbid, but give a bad example, but.
I'm not sure
I mean, would you be able to appropriate, these vans they're public dollars and they sit around 22 hours a day probably.
Right. And I think the advantage of the transportation providers participating in a system like this is that they're not just doing work for their specific agency. So if there's an opportunity to do to do work for another agency or another program, that vehicle is being used in those off hours, if you will.
But again, so I'm an agency. My day staff have gone home. Maybe I've got one evening activity. And I've got the one van, or maybe it's just sitting there and I have an activity inside the building. I'm not trying to be too technical, but there's a van there. How would that be? Say they had two staff there and one driver could be free to do driving. Would you kind of sort of commandeer that van driver and van from that one agency and say you should really pick up many more people from different needs?
I think that
I know these are probably why it hasn't happened is this level of complexity, but it's such a great set of questions.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are multiple options to consider. When we looked at agencies that had vehicles dedicated to the specific program, that's where we really saw the issues with vehicle age and deterioration and availability of vehicles. A program site could lose a vehicle and it could be out of commission for several weeks before they got it back. I think by having kind of a pool of providers to provide backup services in those instances would be a function of this office. And I think it's really the agencies determining eligibility of service and eligibility of location, and then dedicating the funding to support that is going to be what makes that successful. I know that doesn't directly answer that question, but we would expect that with a greater availability, a greater pool of transportation providers to do the type of services that you're talking about, there would be greater opportunity for people to engage more fully in activities.
So can I just interject for a second? I'm informed that the webcast is working.
I'll send out.
It may be bulky, and it may be bulky if people are trying to access it on a mobile device.
Okay.
So that
I'll
may
send
be the
something
barrier,
quick.
but according to the engineer who just stopped by, it is in fact working.
Once I stop talking, I'll send something.
Thank you.
That's what happened for a
just-
while, apparently. So 3 more quickies. Oh, John?
Just one thing as you're sending that out, with the addition of the cart services, I know having done this before, they do add considerable overhead to the transmission. So if people are trying to view this from sites that don't have really good internet connections, that may be what the whole problem is.
Got it. Thank you. 3 more quickies. So the vouchers was a great idea, by the way. I really want to endorse that. Number 2, I just want to stand up for Long Island, who has been complaining for years that the public transportation ends in the evenings, and there is none for the weekend. So that's just a scandal, a tragedy, should we say, and I hope that this approach will help those poor people to have some kind of social and employment life on these off hours. The third thing is really one for John, I guess, and this is maybe too mental health sort of specific, but John, with the non-Medicaid HCBS sort of capability, could that money pay for people to do other than going to treatment? Number two, on that same line, could the self-directed sort of care dollars, when they finally get up, allow people to use that money to also overcome the transportation problem?
So I'll answer your first question first. I think that's in part a negotiation with the federal government, because all of this is contained in our state Medicaid plan. And so those things are not currently anticipated in the plan as it's been presented and approved. That said, would they consider them? I don't off the top of my head know the answer to that. Could you use self-directed care? Possibly. I think there are other financing mechanisms as well that could come into play, both for mental health and a cross-disability kind of issue, including things like, and you didn't mention this, but I just want to have people thinking about it, things like past plans and other things could be used to self-finance access to transportation as well. So it's not just a government provided or recipient provided, but it's how do we meld the complexity of all these things together, as you're correctly pointing out. And part of the problem has been that nobody's thought about how to do that as complex as it is, I think.
We did have one more. When you said you consolidate the agency transportation, do you mean each of these agencies have a transportation bureau? OMH, OASIS, DOH? I wasn't aware that they did.
I wouldn't say that they each have a transportation bureau. What I'm implying is that each agency provides transportation in its own way.
The providers or the state agency?
The state agency.
Okay. Well, didn't know that.
I mean, I think if I could clarify, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's that transportation is a component of easily half a dozen agencies' human services programs. You know, OPWDD, OMH, I think aging, you know, I can think of a number of them. And so then the question becomes, how do those various, and each one has its own criteria, each one has its own funding limitations and stream, and many of them are connected to the underlying program that you need to get to or get from. So it's not as if there's a transportation program per se at each agency. There are funding and support for transportation-related activities.
I thought maybe John was firing up his SUV and picking up people.
Likely. Other public member comments or feedback at this point? Sure.
Thank you so much for the presentation and the work that went into that report. I have a couple of questions. First of all, sort of to piggyback on the question of human services transportation. There was this great quote in the presentation that without transportation to and from services and activities, people cannot be truly integrated. And I want to ask sort of what the extent of activities includes. Because like I'm thinking of, you know, a person, you know, it's your birthday, you want to go out drinking and dancing with your friends from midnight to 4 in the morning. Does this, does this project encompass that as a transportation service, or are people who are in that situation but use a power chair still stuck? Because that to me is integration. First question.
I think we're talking about every facet of activity, you know, because being fully integrated is having the ability to come and go as you please, to go out with your friends, to go to an activity. And so we're thinking broad-based, you know, not just day-to-day activities. It's really being able to go and experience life as everyone else is able to.
Perfect. I like that answer. When this report was assigned, were you informed that the governor would make the authorization of transportation network companies across the state a budget priority for this year?
No, that's not something that we were aware of at the time of our report.
Would it change your report if you knew that Uber, Lyft, and other organizations were going to be doing a lot of this transportation brokering anyway.
I don't think it would change our report. I think, we mentioned the possibility of leveraging TNCs, and that's still a possibility, whether it's upstate or downstate. And I think that adds an opportunity for further leveraging existing transportation resources and maximizing those resources.
Okay, thank you.
Denise?
Yeah, Roger. Just to add to it, I thank you for the report. It is very comprehensive and reinforces many of the things that we've all been advocating for many years in terms of coordinated transportation. And I know that there have been efforts in different parts of the state to do that, and the barriers always become the different rules and regulations that go along with the funding. And so I guess my real question is, how is this council going to be empowered with the ability to change any of that? Because that's always what stops everything. It's the rules for education, transportation, the rules for serving seniors, the requirements for the drivers, the insurance, the liability, the blah, 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 all of it, and that always is the barrier. So that's my question.
I think maybe I should take that
What
question
power or
for you,
authority
Mayor.
will this group have?
So I think the first effort here is to understand, is this a good idea or a bad idea, or somewhere in between? And I would say, I did actually get a couple of emails to the MISC email inbox, the first ones I'd seen in some time, where a couple of people had opinions that were a little more negative than I would have expected, but that's why people have opinions. So I think the first sense that we wanted to get is, hey, is this, and also when looking at the more detailed report, is this sensible? Is it not sensible? Is it sensible in part? What are the priorities, or so on? And then I would like to advance with the folks, who are maybe not in this room, the possibility of that change. And if I can represent that there's a consensus that this seems like a really good idea, then I will advance it in that manner. If half the people love it and half the people hate it, I will share that opinion as well. So I think right now we're at because unlike some other initiatives where I think we're further along in understanding what needed to be done, the reason the report recommended a study rather than a do initially was it's an enormously complicated puzzle, and we were not sure, what is the proper set of steps to accomplish the objective of enhancing those transportation services and access and efficiency of those transportation services. So I think this is the step in the process, is my answer to you. I guess I'd like to know whether any of the public members, any of the state agency or state education department members of the MISC wanted to offer any thoughts or observations at this moment.
Yeah, Roger, this is Mark. I have a couple questions that will be asked if a proposal like this is advanced. So net, if a proposal like this is advanced in next year's budget, are we talking an investment of resources, or are we talking a rededication of resources? How would this proposal be scored on a 3-year basis? Have you guys looked into that at all, PCG?
We didn't look directly at the potential cost. We didn't quantify what that might be, what investments might be necessary. I think the nature of the recommendations would be to maximize efficiency, so the cost per trip would go down, which would essentially save money. But I think the outlying factor that we didn't have data or weren't able to capture is, will the level of need increase? So possibly, there will be more need for the services, and that would, in that nature, increase costs. So we weren't able to quantify what that would look like, or what the initial investment might be, or what the cost savings could be.
Okay. The other question I had was, if I read the slides right, you're talking about carving out the transportation component of all the different human service agencies. So that means that providers that have that in the rates, those provider rates will go down. Now, that's been talked about for years, but the issue there is often to get a true indication of the direct transportation rates is an inexact science. So in a carve-out, I just want to understand what's being proposed here is that actual provider rates and will go down, and those components will be put into a global transportation pot. So it's a great idea, but it has some controversy to it.
So, if I might add, and I think, Mark, your points are well taken, the other complicating factor, and you sort of implied it, but didn't directly address it, which is we've got all of this infrastructure that's been invested in of vans and other things that currently are the property of providers, although the state may have some access and right to title, as well as the federal government, depending on how they were financed. But it sounds like part of this would be pooling all those resources, which is not without a number of legal considerations as you take assets away from one entity and move them to a different place.
Could I throw out one of the experiences I know that I've seen in certain areas, which is where a certain service sector provider becomes the transportation provider for populations that are outside the initial mission of that organization. So a developmental disabilities provider ends up not giving its infrastructure, its transportation infrastructure to another, separate standalone company, but that it ends up doing mental health trips or aging trips or public transit trips in one instance that I can think of. So you might be able to avoid at least some of that challenge by that kind of model.
I have one quick, and I think I know the answer is going to be we just don't know yet. But trying to get my mind around this, I don't even know how to ask this. What are the metrics we should be looking at? What's the gap? What's the hole? Is it, 500,000 rides a day? Is it something? What's the bogey we're shooting at?
I don't think we have a sense of the number. I mean, that's something we weren't able to quantify, is what the gap is in terms of service need versus what's being provided right now and what could be provided. I don't think we were able to gather, from the data that we have to know what that would be. But I think that's an excellent point to really understand the scope of the need.
Yeah.
Can I venture a question, which is, to what degree is the statewide infrastructure necessary to support some perhaps localized pilot projects? Because what I'm hearing in both Mark and Mario's questions is, wow, before we go really big, you need to have, and it's sort of a cart before the horse. If you don't know how many trips and they're not captured in costs and the data's not there, then you can't answer the question. And if you can't answer the question, then how do you support undertaking such an initiative? So I'm wondering to what degree localized experimentation with some lighter touch support from the state might be a pathway to kind of get some of those answers, at least initially.
So we've talked about this internally. One of the reasons why we presented 3 recommendations aimed at kind of 3 different levels was because we do realize that recommendation 1 is an incredible effort. It's a huge change for the way New York does its business. The mobility pilot programs that are recommended for option number 3 are more doable. They're more of kind of like a low-hanging fruit type of situation, but they would still give New York that first step for local mobility management activities, where we're talking about kind of great large-scale reform in recommendation 1. I think there are some activities that could be undertaken before, if that's something that New York wanted to go ahead and implement. There are some things that could be done prior, like doing an independent, doing a more in-depth rate review for each specific agency, doing a regulatory review at each specific agency that would be interested in participating in this model, and really getting some of those activities underway before implementation would occur. Or perhaps doing coordination for multiple agencies on a regional basis. It's really not our recommendation, because then economies of scale can't be fully realized, and taking one region away, and also the agency regions are not necessarily cohesive, so that presents another issue with doing things regionally, but not to say that those things can't be considered or overcome.
So I think that I'd like to maybe spend a few minutes on the second presentation, since we're a bit over. And if you wouldn't mind sticking around for when the public comment, that'd be okay? So John Allen from the Office of Mental Health is here to provide an update on the Employment First initiative. He promises numbers, so we're all very excited on that. And then I would invite those public members members of the public, that is, to please think about the comments that you want to advance, and particularly if you have comments for our PCG and the transportation study, I think that would be most welcome. So John?
Great. Let's go to the first slide, and I want to begin by talking about the governor's executive order that created the Employment First Commission, and just remind everyone what the very concrete, specific goals that the governor tasked us as the Employment First Commission in doing. One is to increase employment among people with disabilities by 5%. And specifically people who are receiving services. And I think that's important when I share the numbers with you of how we've sort of captured that. The second is to decrease poverty rate from that same population by 5%. And the last task was to register 100 businesses as champions, if you will, to advance disability employment. So next slide, please. Here's the numbers, and this is really kind of monumental in a way, because if you look across the literature around the country, no one has made this kind of number set available using this data. In New York State, we currently have in the index year, so the index year is the year the governor created this executive order. So that's our base year to look at data. 699,287 New Yorkers who have been deemed disabled by the federal government for SSI disability, who are on Medicaid. Now, why did we choose that subset of population? In part because it's the population that we can count in real time. And so there may be others that include other people with disabilities that we're not capturing, but they're not populations that we have data on or that we can easily obtain data on in a regular real-time basis. Of that 699,000 people, 69,254 were employed. Now, employed, we didn't look at levels of employment, but I'll give you some of that in a minute. So this is literally hot off the press. We completed this preliminary data analysis and then fact-checking 2 days ago. And so this is as hot as you can get. These are individuals who had earnings reported from their employer. So there may be other people that are working off the books. There may be other people who are doing jobs for other individuals, but this is wages reported to Tax and Finance. So that's where the data comes from. So of the 69,000, or 699,000, 69,254 were working at that time, 9.9%. We often talk about using the census tract data, which shows a higher rate of employment, but those are not necessarily people who are in state services. And so that actually skews the data in a way, because people who are in state services, this is actually the people who are in a variety of different kinds of state services, and we can analyze that. So next slide, please. So I want to give you a start of a comparison to statewide data. In the 2015 data, 9 million New Yorkers were working. That means there were 9 million New Yorkers who had wages. Now, when you think about all New Yorkers, children obviously are not in that workforce, and certain seniors may not be in that workforce. But of all the people in New York State, of the 19 million or so residents that we had in 2015, 9,011,903 were working. So compare that to the 699,000 people with disabilities on SSI who are on Medicaid, and the number of people that are working. You get 0.77% of the workforce are people with disabilities who are employed. Now, that's not a reflection of how many are working, because then you need to look at how many people is that a percentage of, because number of people with disabilities is not universal in the workforce. And so if you just look at the percentage of people who are working who are disabled, it's 9.9%. So next slide, please. Average wages. And this is data that sets the threshold by which we will continually look at the governor's Employment First agenda, and do we accomplish the goals the governor set out for us. And then I'm going to give you in a couple of minutes an update on how we're doing with that and where are we with that. So if you look at the average wage for New Yorkers in 2015, based on tax and finance data, it was $67,527. The average wage for New Yorkers with disabilities on SSI, $15,213. Now, I'm going to tell you that that number, 15,000, is skewed. And I'll show you the data on that in a minute. There are a very small number of people who earn way above the federal poverty level, and I mean way above the federal poverty level. And the majority of people who are working earn way below the federal poverty level. And so the majority that are working skew this average. So it really isn't, the average probably isn't a good reference number to use, but I knew that you all would be interested in it, so I included it in the presentation. If we look at then just wages, average wages for New Yorkers compared to average wages of people with disabilities who are eligible for Medicaid, they earn 22.5% of what a non-disabled New Yorker earns on average. So next slide, please. So when we look at the disability poverty rate, so remember the second goal that's in the Governor's Employment First Commission is to reduce the poverty rate of people with disabilities. I wanted to show you what the actual poverty rate is for our index year. Again, same number of people with disabilities who are working, 69,254. Of those earning less than poverty, 68,000 were earning less than poverty. So the overwhelming majority of people in New York State who are working are earning less than poverty. Now, I don't want to make this an assumption where you assume that we're paying people less than poverty. This less than poverty, as we've begun analyzing the work trends and when people are stopping work, is more closely associated with Social Security, disability benefits, and work incentives, or, said in a different way, lack of understanding about work incentives and lack of use of the work incentives that exist. And so I'm going to come back and talk about that theme in just a minute. But only 927 people in New York State who are on SSI or have that designation of being disabled on Medicaid, that would include the Medicaid buy-in, And so, Harvey, you asked me the number of the Medicaid buy-in, and I'm going to give it to you now, but I'll also give it to you in a minute. Staff just ran it for that for May 1st of this year, 11,903 people. Significant increase from where we were before, and I'm going to explain why we've gotten an increase. Because we've heard you, and we heard all of you concerns about this. We've been doing a lot of things about it. I'm not sure that you're aware how much we've been doing about it, so I want to reflect on that. So this 927 people have earned more than the federal poverty rate for a family of one. Now, we weren't able to analyze in this first set of analysis how many were in a family of one. So federal poverty might actually be higher for people with disabilities if they're married or have children or others. That's data that we will begin to analyze. But for our initial cut, we assumed family of one poverty level, and we presented that data to you. So next slide, please. So what we have been doing to address the governor's Employment First challenge is to focus on two different tasks. And so there have been two different tracks as the Employment First Commission has worked on this set of issues. Track one was to look to create linkages between employers and people with disabilities. So if we're going to get people with disabilities hired, we've got to connect them to the people who are hiring and make that an efficient process. Track two is to address the benefits concerns from people with disabilities. And when we look at and do further analysis of the earnings rates, you can see that people are dropping out of employment at a particular rate. Anecdotally, my quick analysis of looking at the data was it looks when people are at about 75% of the trial work period amount. And so individuals, for whatever reason, who are not on SSDI are using the trial work period amount as an indicator. Why? Who knows, because they're not related, but they're using that set of numbers and dropping out of the workforce at about 75% of the maximum amount that you can achieve. So for the very first time, we've got data that no one has had anywhere in the world about these kind of statistics. Next slide. So what are we doing to link people with disabilities to employers and employers to people with disabilities? Well, we wanted to do a couple things. First is when we heard from all of you in the Employment First Commission and others, we want to create a system that can track outcomes. It was very clear, and I've heard consistently, give us the numbers, give us the numbers. Well, it took a little while to get them because no one's done this kind of analysis before. So we actually had to marry multiple systems together to do that, taking Medicaid data and matching it to tax and finance data. You would think is a simple thing. It is not a simple process because the information is not the exact same. We also needed to build a system we felt strongly based on existing methods that employers use to hire people. We did not want to create a system that was a one-off or a specialty disability system, but that built on the system that all people, whether they're a New Yorker with or without disabilities, could use, that was fully integrated for everyone. And so that's one of our cornerstones. Next slide. And so part of our process, though, of achieving a 5% increase in employment is really a simple exercise of numbers. And when I said that we could actually achieve this, I mean this year, and I mean realistically achieve it. And so I want to give you what our plan is and what the numbers are. So we begin with looking at how many vendors or contractors does New York State have. Turns out 254,104 vendors. Well, not all those vendors are businesses. Some of them are private individuals who do things for the state in a variety of ways. So this is for all state agencies. This isn't one state agency. This is how many people the state pays on a regular basis. We identified that 54,099 were actually business enterprises and had federal employment identification numbers. And of them, the majority actually had emails in our payment system. Why? Because people like to know when they're getting paid. And so this makes it very efficient for us to communicate with them and begin sharing what the governor's executive order says. So next slide, please. So we created a campaign. This is not a single mailing or a single project. It is a multi-year campaign to engage all of these contractors in saying, you do business with New York State, we expect you to support the state's goals. One of the state's goals is employment of people with disabilities, and we're going to track whether you do or not. And so to help do that, we began with promoting the employability toolkit. Many of you may be familiar with this already. It was a toolkit developed initially for individuals with developmental disabilities, and the consortium and other work groups that we've worked with have expanded it to include all people with disabilities. Every New York State contractor has now been sent the employability toolkit. But we didn't just want to send the toolkits. We wanted to be able to track, did they actually open it? Did they actually look at it? For how long did they look at it? Did they just open it and click, oh, yep, I looked at it, okay. Exit it. We actually are using a very sophisticated process that we can actually identify whether they open it, whether they look at it, how long they look at it, and do they do something with it. And so this campaign is not just, well, we've contacted them, I'm done. It is, do they change the behavior and ultimately hire people with disabilities? And so the toolkit promotes information on tax credits, benefits of diverse workforce, and really the resources to help develop an inclusive workforce strategies. This is based on promoting the New York State Job Bank. If you remember, I said we wanted to use existing resources and make this mainstreamed in a way that employers didn't have to change their behavior and people with disabilities didn't have to be disadvantaged by a separate or disparate or different system. And so our goal is to get every New York State contractor to register job openings in the New York State Job Bank. This, in fact, will benefit all New Yorkers, and specifically New Yorkers with disabilities, as we help people with disabilities take advantage of what's in the job bank. And so we're actually tracking how many of these 59,000 vendors register to put jobs in the job bank and then actually post opportunities in the job bank. So again, this is not, we're just taking your word for it. You wanted outcomes and you wanted metrics. We're holding and looking to hold people accountable directly to produce real outcomes. Now, our goal is through this campaign ultimately to get people with disabilities hired. And because we know every individual by name and information who's been deemed disabled and is in the Medicaid system, we can look to see immediately via tax and finance data when and if any are hired and exactly where they're hired and how much money they make. So for the very first time, we can hold, not by self-report, not by providers telling us, oh, we've already met our quota, we've already done our part, thank you very much, but to actually look, have they responded in a very positive way? So next slide, please. So we've created in this mailing linkages to Job Zone and Career Zone. Why? Because we also, if we're dealing with the employer side, we need to educate individuals with disabilities on how to access jobs in the job bank. And it is clear that not everyone has taken advantage of that, nor understands the great benefits and tools that we've been working with our colleagues at Department of Labor to advance the smart technology and the linkages there. By using Career Zone and Job Zone and posting your resume there, it automatically creates some opportunities for you to find real jobs from this list and have employers hire you. So I want to show you to make sure all of you who are advocates both know how to do this, but also that you've got the tools to educate others in how to take advantage of this. And then lastly, on this slide, we've been building in some entitlement assistance. So when you see that jump for the Medicaid buy-in, it is not because we've been sitting on our hands and silent. We've heard you, that you wanted us to do something. I've had several meetings with DOH and the New York City counterparts about increasing the accessibility of that. We've been working to help fix some of those bridges that needed to be built, and in fact been using the data system that we have to educate providers and how to help individuals get access to the buy-in, and educate individuals with disabilities on how to get access to the buy-in. So next slide. So Job Zone and Career Zone, if you're not familiar with it, are ways that you, as any New Yorker, can look to enhance your resume and post it, and actually use your resume to query jobs that are really available in New York. Now, I say these webinars coming in January because we've actually already begun them, webinars on how to use Job Zone and Career Zone and how to actually do it. So next slide. Here's Job Zone. For those of you that have not seen the web page, it is a fairly complicated web page, but it has a bunch of tools, if you're looking for work, that allow you to take your resume and see other people who've been hired in the jobs that you're looking for, and see how you would enhance your own resume. Next slide. Career Zone is aimed for people with lower literacy levels, or younger people or individuals that have limited or no work experience, and provides the same kind of tools and availability to assist individuals in doing so. Next slide. There's some very specific information, if you're not familiar with how to use these tools, that we've tried to make disability friendly by including videos that walk you through step by step each step of the way. These are available on the NICE, New York Employment Service System webpage, under the Customer Information tab. Next slide. So here's a listing of some of the videos that are available. Creating a free account, my portfolio, how to actually do a job match, how to use the smart technology, how to upload your resume. There's a series of about a dozen videos for each of Job Zone and Career Zone that each take about 10 to 15 minutes to view. So if you already are computer literate, you already have an email address, you can jump right to where you want to start and it'll walk you through it. If you don't have an email address, it'll tell you how to get a free email address and get started. Next slide. All of this is based on our partnership with Department of Labor and the skill matching and referral technology that we've previously talked about, which uses an individual's experiences and background to match them to discrete jobs. You've asked us multiple times to look at the 55B program, and we're meeting with civil service to actually use this technology, potentially, to list individuals who are eligible for the entry-level 55B jobs in state service on the hiring list to accomplish the goal that you've asked us to set out. Next slide. Here's the matching list that comes from that smart technology. It's not an artificial list. This actually comes from the Workforce Board, and you'll see there are jobs, and to the left of them there's a star system that tells me how close that opportunity is to the resume that I used to submit. It gives me real time, real jobs, and more importantly, on the right-hand side, it lets me click on one of these actions to actually apply for that job online. Not just telling me about it, actually apply for the job. And by applying for it, the employer knows that you've come from the smart system, so your skills match their requirements. Next slide. Here's a different way of viewing it, of looking at other job matches that give you categories, again, with more in-depth information about each of the employers. Next slide. So our goal, and I've already mentioned this, is to take this technology and see if we can incorporate it within civil service. And our target is by the end of this calendar year, we hope to have that up and running, where an individual with disability who has 55B eligibility could post their resume on a particular web page, and that would put their name and their information on the hiring list for state jobs that they appear to be eligible for based on the smart technology matching. Next slide. So I mentioned entitlement assistance, and what's critical is if we don't address the entitlement assistance, we know, and I gave you the data of how many people are keeping their earnings artificially low to stay below poverty so that they don't lose their entitlements. We've got a number of benefits that we could immediately help people for. And I want to just mention what we have been doing behind the scenes that we've not been talking to you regularly about. Is this year we used the NICE employment system, identified last year 823 people who were eligible for earned income tax credit, notified them and helped them complete the paperwork to apply for it and benefit from it. This year, in 2017, we sent out 1,267 notices to help individuals with disabilities look at and apply for earned income tax credit, which is huge. Additionally, we've been using the system to identify people who appear to be eligible for the Medicaid buy-in, sending them and their provider information on the Medicaid buy-in toolkit so that they know how to apply, they know what the eligibility requirements are, they know how to access it, and helping them understand it. We're working with Social Security right now to identify individuals who would be eligible for 1619B. We know that most individuals do not get to take advantage of it in an automated way, and if we can notify that you're eligible, then you could contact Social Security and ask that be turned on and get a huge advantage of protecting your SSI eligibility for an extended period of time until you earn more than the state threshold amount. That's huge, and we hope to have that up and running, the 1619B, this summer. EITC and the Medicaid buy-in are already up and fully functioning and have been, and I would suggest that the increase in the Medicaid buy-in is directly, partially responsible from this tool. Next slide. The Business Leadership Network. We've been working with a number of folks around the state to expand the number of members. We have financed a Business First Symposium for this year with the Business Leadership Network, and they already have over 100 businesses participating. So we've already met that goal, and we continue to expand beyond that. Next slide. So you've asked for regular updates, and although it says coming soon, if you go to the NICE webpage, there's now a button on the left. I will admit that I didn't notice the button myself, and it's my own webpage. So we've actually put a tab at the top that says Employment First Commission as well. You can go there and see the updated information that we're regularly posting. But I've said this before, and I will again offer any of you that have questions or would like additional information or have additional advocacy that you'd like to talk to us about, call me and set up a time. I'm happy to meet with you and try to help you understand these issues. And I believe that is it for my slides. So,
Did you give the Medicaid buy-in numbers? I don't remember.
11,000. This was as of May 1st, so I just had it run. 11,903.
And how much was it last time we talked about?
Right around 9,000.
So at this point, I'd actually like to move to the public comment period, just out of deference for both the time and folks who made themselves available to come. So thank you, Annette. And if we have a few moments after, I imagine the public members and the agency members can probably speak directly to folks that they may have concerns with. Brad Williams.
Okay. Oh, do I need to turn this? Is that on? There we go. All right. And this is kind of awkward. I think I'm gonna pull a chair.
Can you pick it up? Maybe
Brad, you can. Brad, I think you can just pull it right out of the stand there if you want to.
I think I'm gonna. because I need my notes are kind of my reasonable accommodation. So there we go. So I want to thank John for his notes. Those were very good. That was an excellent update. So thank you very much. And based on you know, the Employment First overall goals of the 5% respectively for, you know, the employment rate and poverty rates, you know, I basically, you know, have been tracking them overall. This was kind of interesting to get that from, you know, is kind of like the SSI benefits, Medicaid, employed perspective. But we use the Disability Compendium, which is www.disabilitycompendium.org to do that, and that's overall, and they kind of track things for the entire country. And basically between 2014 to 16 for New York, and this is working aged individuals 18 to 64, you know, the employment rate was around 31%, and then rose up to like 33%, but then it stabilized by 2016. Poverty rate was at like 29% or 28%, then went to 29%, then 30%. The one other thing to note is that in the 2015, and they only did it for that particular year, they looked out, they kind of carved out the full-time year-round of employment for this same age group. So it was a subset of that group, and that was at 18.8%, which is really bad. It's really disturbing, actually. That means like a lot of the other individuals were part-time. I think of many of my myself and many of my colleagues how we must be the anomaly. Those of us who have been employed full-time year-round many of these years. It's quite a statistic, and it says a lot about this. So I do support everyone's efforts and appreciate the hard work that's been accomplished that, you know, John has talked about, that's been moving things along. But what I'm going to ask, you know, I've kind of been stating for a bit, because I think it'll really help move what these overall goals, you know, which were stated. You know, the increasing the employment rate by 5%, decreasing the poverty rate by 5%, and obviously the 100 businesses have already been achieved. But, you know, I call upon the governor to actively support the Employment First policy and make it a commitment to its full implementation. Because, you know, the Employment First Commission created a report with recommendations. And to fully support integrated competitive employment. You know, this is consistent with the governor's wage policies. And New Yorkers must earn minimum wage or higher in inclusive work settings and opportunities. If you go to the Disability Compendium and you see some of the wage statistics, there's a humongous gap. And John certainly presented that based on his statistics today. And there's something that has to be done here related to that. I also think the governor could make it a priority in a 2018 State of the State address. I'm often told when I do this on a yearly basis, you're too late in the cycle. Guess what? I am not late now. Okay? I can advance priorities identified in this Employment First report, and they are there, and they've been there through the 2018-19 executive budget. So that is all part of this cycle. And there are some wonderful recommendations that are in there. And John has certainly identified things that you are actively working on and you're making inroads. And it's great, okay? But many of us have been talking about, and you're going to hear about, the small business tax credit, the minority you know, state procurement program, which is great because people with disabilities are a minority. They're part of this program, and it works in many different ways because for those of us who have to go through that program, we want more vendors to choose from. And then if you're a vendor, you want to be able to market your program. So right now, You could be a woman-owned business, a minority-owned business. You can be a dual classification. Okay, so if you're disability, someone could be all three, or be two in any one of those different designations, and you can market your services that way. It's actually a benefit to be able to do that. And I know because we use MWBE vendors, you want to have that ability. Okay, it works to your advantage. And it works to your advantage whether you are the vendor or whether you're the business seeking out those services, and to have more vendors in the process. So this works. And it also works in the state of Massachusetts, where they actually have identified their procurement program to be, you know, minorities, people with disabilities, women, veterans, and the LGBTQ community. Okay, so I mean,
I'm sorry. I'm wondering if you could maybe wrap up. We've got a bunch of folks who are.
So, anyways, you know, we identify the 55B coordinator, Medicaid Brian, you know, in terms of utilizations working, and you know, all the things that are in there. So please continue to do that. We really want that support. So thank you.
Thank you, Frank Panisi.
I'm going to pick up where Brad left off. John, please don't take any of this personally. It's not directed at you, but you're the only conduit we have to the administration. Until 20 minutes ago, I would have said that this report with the recommendations is 2 years, 2 months, and 10 days old. And until your presentation, I would have said absolutely nothing has happened with it. What is the holdup here? I did some research. 8 members of the MISC are also members of the Employment First Commission. Why isn't it moving? Some of what you're doing is very good, but we are not aware of it. And the things we're asking about, I know enhancement of 55B, A, B, and C is good. Is there going to be a coordinator hired? This is a position that existed before. In my agency, we could take out the old job description, tweak it, put out the announcement, and have somebody hired within a month. 2 years. Where is the person? Until there's somebody directing that program, it's going to stay underused as it's been for its whole life. I know originally the recommendation was to include disability in the MWBE program. I know we've been told that isn't going to happen. We are working on legislation, but at this point, I'm really seriously wondering, would the governor sign it if we get it passed? And I have to say, I don't think so. Medicaid buy-in, it's good that we're increasing the numbers, but it still needs to be, it's criminally underused. We could be saving the state a lot of money, getting a lot of people to work. The recommendation was to incorporate that into the state application rather than leaving it up to local DSS offices, who, even though they were trained on it, I know because my agency had one of the grants, we had 10 counties. As soon as that grant ended, DSS offices don't even know it exists. They'll tell people there's no such thing. They'll tell people they're not qualified without even looking to see if they are. We could be using that to a much, much greater extent, and that's got to happen. The small business tax credit. In the recommendations, it was recommended that the developmental disabilities tax credit be expanded to include all disabilities. We were told that the governor's budget would have some sort of a tax incentive for small businesses, or for businesses, period. And it didn't happen. We are working on legislation for that. But again, I'm worried he won't sign it, because nothing I have seen so far gives me any indication that that would happen. And the fact of the matter is, the SMART system, that's great to link people to jobs, but the average mom and pop restaurant or cleaning service or whatever, when they need somebody to work there, they're not going to go to a state website to advertise it. They're going to stick a sign in the window. They're going to put out an ad in the local penny saver. That's how people get hired. The small businesses are never going to go to a state website. That's not going to happen. So although that's good, the tax credit, the tax incentive would go a long way to actually getting people hired. And that's all I've got to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And with apology, I think it's Julie Farah or Farah? Farah. Thank you.
I'm a policy fellow with the Center for Disability Rights, and although I could go on to talk about employment, I wanted to talk about transportation. Actually, I am, like I said, a policy fellow. I'm also a power chair user, and I am reliant on public transportation. And my biggest concern, I think it's the same kind of thing. This is a great report with a lot of great potential. My biggest concern is if we have a system that is not coordinated right now and is not working right now, and we want to add this office on top of it, are we just kind of coordinating the rearranging of services that just don't exist? And one call or one click to be able to find out in a rural area that you have no access to transportation is not a solution. It's fancy, and it actually will provide jobs for people, which I sincerely hope will be people with disabilities who are public transit reliant. I think it's very important that you have those voices there. I heard a lot about, we heard from providers, we heard from, so we heard a lot from service providers about problems, but did you actually hear from people like myself about what those problems are and some pretty creative ideas around finding solutions to those problems, because they do exist out there. We never want to pool money. Don't ever pool money, because the pool gets smaller and smaller and smaller and dries up. But braiding funding and allowing for some creativity so that transportation isn't disability specific, population specific, age specific, county specific, those are great ideas, but it has to start with changing the mindset of those providers and looking at what those barriers really are. So I think it's a good first step, but the implementation of all of those ideas is not really going to happen. I'm just very afraid that it's adding one more bureaucratic layer to an already struggling infrastructure that doesn't even exist, and not providing more opportunities for people to get to where they want and need to go. And like was suggested by Adam Prizio, that sometimes does include dancing on the table at midnight in a bar to celebrate your birthday, not just going to day programs or going to the doctor or going to those things that people with disabilities should be funneled into doing according to what a provider's capacity or provider's services are. So I think it's a good first step, but the realization of this is something completely different, and I'm very worried that it's just adding some more layers of complications and some more funding onto something that doesn't really address the root causes of a lot of these problems, including inaccessible ride sharing.
Thank you, and I can say on behalf of the MISC, our thought is to have the report on transportation, and then, any thoughts we may have about what parts are worthwhile implementing, what sorts of proposals might be advanced. We want to bring them not only to this meeting, but make sure that we had a robust engagement. And I know that part of the report involved engagement with people with disabilities. I know independent living centers were engaged, among other entities. But yeah, we wouldn't want to develop something that didn't actually solve problems that people are experiencing. So thank you.
Thank you.
And once again, I'm going to butcher somebody's name. Greg. Thank you, Greg.
Trying. Okay. I'm going to change pace a little bit, going on something that's not on the agenda, but CDR is, I'm with the Center for Disability Rights. CDR and many in the disability community are greatly concerned about the reimbursement rates right now for complex rehab technology. We're getting, providers are telling people that they can't provide certain things because reimbursement rates are below cost for things as basic as motors for CRT wheelchairs. If we don't have access if our community doesn't have access to this equipment, any other things to get us out into the community are probably going to many of us are going to keep us, locked away. And, this is something that needs to be addressed. Right now, we don't see anything coming out of DOH or the second floor or, anywhere that really says we're committed to making sure this equipment's available. There's a few members of the Assembly and the Senate that are trying to work on this, but, I want to see this addressed, and, haven't quite seen this, and, going back over the minutes of the meetings here, so.
Thank you. It's not an issue that we have addressed here or has been brought up, but we'll make your comments aware to folks subsequent to this. I think I'll be reasonably successful with this one. Erica Jones.
I made an easy one just for you.
Thank you.
Well, this is mainly about transportation. I am also from the Center for Disability Rights, the Rochester facility. I was really pleased to see that Western New York and Central New York were acknowledged, because those are often dead zones as far as transportation goes for people with disabilities. I am in a position where I actually grew up in Herkimer County, so I know perfectly well about that, and I live in Rochester now, so I'm the transportation advocate. I should be very aware of that. So as far as that goes, I'm really pleased. That is very true that we do have a restriction as far as transportation goes in the rural areas. And while it's great that we keep talking about we're building this plan and here's what the steps we're taking, what are we doing now? There are still people trapped in institutions who rely on housing, they rely on transportation that they don't have. And unfortunately, without that, they can't get out into the community. If you can't take the bus, you're forced to take paratransit, and you can't take paratransit same day. So we're constantly having to plan our lives days in advance if we're lucky enough to get a ride. And without that, you don't see friendly faces, you can't go see loved ones. So this is a really terrible situation for people with disabilities in general who just want to go out and hang out with their friends. We called in the budget for more accessible transportation throughout the state. And for all our troubles, what we got was, we're bringing ride sharing. But not only are we bringing ride sharing, we're going to tie your hands behind your back. The city councils, the localities are not allowed to put any kind of adjustment to it to say, okay, in this area, ride sharing's coming in, but here's what we can do to bring in access. They're not allowed to do that. They're only allowed to vote yes or no. So that puts us in a really tough position, particularly in Rochester, who only relies on RTS right now. Like I said, paratransit, you have to plan your life in advance. And if you can't take the bus, that's not an option either. So what are we doing for the folks that are trapped right now, is my question. I have a friend who lives in Webster. She has a home in the community, but she lives in Webster, which is one of the burbs. And unfortunately, RTS will only come certain times, and Sunday hours are even more limited. So if she wants to go to church, she wants to go to the grocery store, she wants to go to CDR events, any of those things, she either can't go or she has to know a week in advance when she's going to go. And if something gets canceled or delayed, she's in trouble because she no longer has a ride home. So what are we doing right now about this? And how are we going to address when Uber comes to Rochester, decides that they don't want to work with anyone about access and then pulls out, as they have done in other places. Thank you.
Thank you. Alyssa Ginevra?
Hi, Alyssa Ginevra, Center for Disability Rights. I work as an MFP transition specialist getting individuals with disabilities out of nursing homes, and they face a lot of obstacles. First off, there's a lack of accessible housing, and then in order to make sure the housing is truly accessible and is going to meet someone's needs, they need transportation to get there. So they have to jump through the hoops to get paratransit, and that's a lot. It really is. There are nursing homes that have a little teeny tiny whiteboard that lists the few residents that have the paratransit. And then they have to save their money because they have to pay their NAMI so that they don't get kicked out of the nursing home. If they're a smoker, it's going to take them even longer to save up that money so they can go and see that apartment to make sure that it's actually accessible enough for them, to make sure that it's not in a shady area, because some of the accessible housing is in shady areas. If they're looking to move into an area that's rural, they just have to hope that there's some way they can get there. And if they need to be able to see it on the weekend because there's a family member that they're waiting on, they can't go most likely because the paratransit is extremely limited, even in the city where most of it is, as is. But then if you want to see it on the evening, if you want to see it during the weekends, you probably can't make it out there. If you want to see it in the suburbs, you're probably not getting there in the weekend. And when a place calls you and they cancel and they say, I'm sorry, it got rented out, you can't do that. Or when they call you and they say, well, can you come at 4 o'clock today? They can't come at 4 o'clock. And they're trying to scrounge up their money to go there. And then there are apartments that are accessible and they have openings. But they're being told, if you want to live at this apartment and you actually want to leave your apartment for things that Medicaid isn't going to cover, like for you to go grocery shopping, for you to go see friends, for you to go to church, for you to go to work, you need to pay extra money to go. It is $8 every time you want to go somewhere. That is not something that people want to do. They say, that's not much better than the nursing home. I'm not in the nursing home having all these random people around me, but I can't go much of anywhere. And that's not what people want. So they continue to sit in the institution hoping that they can get out, and the transportation is not helping the already poor housing that we have in the Rochester region. Thank you.
Thank you. Margot Downey?
Hi. My comments do tie to transportation and employment. First of all, I would like to mention that the documents upon the MISC website concerning to the mobility studies are not accessible to screen readers, the PDF files. And so I would like for those to be made accessible so that I can read them. And I appreciate the in-depth reporting of them today because that did help. Secondly, when we talk about employment, talk about literacy. Did you all know that 90% of blind people who are employed read Braille? A lot of people in this state, a lot of teachers, legislators, hopefully not anybody on this council, believe that Braille is unimportant because people can use their computers, use a tape recorder, use a reader, but you can't learn to spell that way, and you really can't learn to be literate that way. So I would like the Department of Education to investigate and to tell us why you have not implemented regulations regarding the Braille bill, literacy bill that was passed 16 years ago. Why has it not been implemented? Why are there not regulations and rules concerning that? We've already been to the legislature about this, and they will be asking the Department of Education the same questions. As far as transportation is concerned, I really appreciate all the efforts being made to coordinate transportation. And I know there are going to be a lot of growing pains, but I think we can all do that. Thank you.
And Ms. Downey, I know you made us aware of the issues on the website with the materials, and we're trying to find solutions to that. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. And our last person, Julia and Philip Pierre.
It's Phillipson.
Thank you.
I want to first of all make a couple of comments on the transportation issues, and I do appreciate that you're doing this. It's long overdue to look at it statewide. Blind people are routinely not said to be not eligible for paratransit. And blind people should be the most eligible for paratransit. But I wanted to speak about blind people in nursing homes. And the previous person that talked about that identified a lot of what the problem is. But blind people in nursing homes are not being served in the most appropriate coordinating environment. That is a very extremely confining environment for them. And they need to be gotten out of there. They need to get their own home. They need rehabilitation. And they need the proper supports. With the proper support, they can live independently, or at least most of them can, and learn to do that just fine. Thank you.
Thank you. So this concludes our meeting, and I would invite folks. Yeah.
One comment before you close?
For you, Harvey? Sure.
30 seconds. I just think we've said enough here today about appreciating what the agency and John is doing, but recognizing that we want to elevate this to the governor's office. And I think what we should do is schedule a meeting with the governor's staff and you good people to talk more about this, and we'll be following up with that.
Thank you, Harvey. So as I mentioned, the video from today's meeting, as well as the presentations, will be up on the Olmsted website, and we will, of course, work to make sure that the presentations are presented in an accessible format. So apologies for that. And thank you all for your attendance and for being here today. Thanks. Bye-bye.